Okay, well, we still got people coming in, but I think we do have some preliminaries to go through. So so I think we'll get started. So I just welcome everybody. My name is Andrew Nelson. I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology here at Western University in London, Ontario. This event is really a creature of Zoom. As Neil was pointing out today, our speaker is from Oxford. We're here in Little London, Ontario. Our land acknowledgement is being given from Birmingham, England, and the question moderator is in upstate New York. So this is we've got people coming from Europe, from all over North America, and I gather from some even in South America. So it's a great turnout for a very exciting event, a very exciting speaker. So I will start by pointing out that this session is being recorded. So please use your video accordingly. Once the order of events here is that once I'm done here, which will be very quickly, Lauren Poeta will give our land acknowledgement. Then Chris Ellis will give, this is a named lecture. This lecture is named after Michael Spence. And so Chris Ellis will give a short description of why we did name the lecture after Dr. Spence. And then Neil Ferris will actually introduce the speaker. And then at long last, we'll actually get to the speaker. So anyway, so with that, and then there will be questions at the end that'll be moderated by Lindsay Bell. So usual Zoom protocols, please keep yourself muted during the lecture. If you've got questions, put them into the chat, and then Lindsay will moderate afterwards and either read out of the chat or take questions. We can have people put their hands up and things like that at the end. Okay, so welcome again, everybody, and I will hand the screen, I guess, over to Lauren.
Hi, hello everybody. Bonjour. Ani Lauren Indigenous cause, Wababagakwe Digo, Weekwem Kong Donji Ba. Hello, my name is Lauren, and my spirit name is Falling Leaves Woman. My family is from the Weekwemkong unceded territory, and I was raised on Curve Lake First Nation, both communities of the Anishinaabeg. I was asked to give the land acknowledgement for our department to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewuk, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombrecht Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. As a department, we respect and support the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers and rightful stewards of the land that we are occupying. However, members of our Western community and all those others part of this lecture are spread across numerous other Indigenous territories with their own unique histories and peoples, stressing the importance of us acknowledging our colonial past and colonial present as a complex whole. Land acknowledgements are not a product of colonial institutions, but they are a practice deeply rooted in Indigenous culture and understandings of our world and fortunes. Land is part of who we are. It is a mixture of our blood, our past, our present, and our future. While we are not able to gather in person, we have been given a really unique opportunity to reconnect to the land around us. With this, I hope you are able to get outside during these strange times and feel the healing nature our land is able to offer you. Thank you, and Chimigwech.
Chris, can you take it from here?
Yes, now, okay, sure. It's a pleasure for me to say a few words about the annual Michael Spence Lecture, and of course, Mike himself, who I can see here in one of the boxes right below me on my screen anyway, on there. Mike is my good friend and longtime colleague, and it's a real pleasure to say some things about him. It's hard to say a few words about Mike, and certainly in the 1 to 2 minutes I was told to take today, I think I could spend hours on Mike and his accomplishments. But to begin, in 1970, Mike was the third member hired in the newly formed at the time Department of Anthropology at Western, and he remained here until his retirement, which I think was in 2006, but Michael, correct me if I'm wrong on that. To honor him after his retirement, the department established this annual lecture series. Mike did his anthropology BA and MAs at the University of Toronto. And there he became interested in Ontario archaeology. I don't think he had much interest in it before that, but he eventually did his MA thesis on Ontario archaeology and made himself basically became an expert, if not the expert, on the early and middle woodland archaeology of Ontario. But for his PhD, he went to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, to indulge his longstanding interest in Mesoamerican archaeology, and notably at the famous World Heritage Site of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico. And his doctoral dissertation was focused on the skeletal biology of the peoples that occupied that major urban centers. But he's also carried out analyses of lithics and everything else. He's a jack of all trades, as I will talk about. I personally discovered Mike's Ontario and Mesoamerican work when I was an undergraduate. I'm not hoping to make Mike feel older by saying that, but I did. But I subsequently discovered that there was a whole host of Ontario archaeologists that did not know that Mike even worked in Mexico at the time. Regardless, Mike has a split personality. He not only spent his career working extensively in two geographic areas, very different ones, but he was not just an archaeologist, but also a human skeletal biologist. And indeed, I think you can argue he was the first real Canadian bioarchaeologist who combined his interest in biological anthropology and archaeology. Now, he also was a split personality in that he didn't just do academic work. He not only spent his career, he used many years, he used his interest in skeletal biology serving in forensic expert in identification, and was in fact involved in some of the most famous cases in southwestern Ontario, lending his expertise in skeletal biology to those things, and many CRM projects as a practical aspect of it. Mike published and continues to publish to this day academic papers. He's trained many students, both undergraduate and graduate, and nurtured colleagues such as myself. And as a result, he's received several honors, both for his Ontario and his Mesoamerican work. He received the Smith-Windenberg Award for his Canadian contributions, an award that has been referred to as the Canadian Archaeological Association's Nobel Prize. Yet he is also one of the few Mesoamerican archaeologists asked to write a paper on himself, essentially a mini autobiography, for the leading journal Ancient Mesoamerica, published by Cambridge University Press. On a personal note, I think I first discovered how highly Mike was thought of for his Mesoamerican work when a new faculty member at Western in the early 1990s, I attended the Society for American Archaeology meetings in New Orleans. At the end of the meeting, I shared a cab at the hotel with someone else when we found we were both going to the airport, and we both attended the archaeology meeting. So he asked me if I had attended the archaeology meeting. And when I admitted I had, he asked me where I was based, and I said, the University of Western Ontario. He immediately looked at me and exclaimed excitedly, "Are you Michael Spence?" Sadly, I had to disappoint him that I was not, but he was impressed that I even knew Michael. I cannot speak too highly of Mike, and he certainly deserves the honor of these annual lectures in his name. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. All right, Neil, would you like to introduce our speaker?
I would. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker at the Spence Lecture, Dr. Dan Hicks. Dr. Hicks holds the position of Professor of Contemporary Archaeology in the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. He is also the curator of world archaeology at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and he's a fellow at St. Cross College in Oxford. Dan is also one of the founders of CHAT, which stands for Contemporary and Historical Archaeology and Theory, which has worked for much of the last 2 decades to significantly expand the purview of archaeological research. Indeed, much of Dan's career has been marked by his pushing archaeology in new research directions, as well as directing an archaeological gaze towards a reflexive consideration of the world we find ourselves in, and those material and immaterial connections of the past that have come to shape our present and our imagined futures. It's actually a bit of a challenge to succinctly define Dan's research interests, and even harder to label that diversity of thought. Ostensibly, he's a contemporary and historical archaeologist, an ethnographer of materiality, a theorist, and a cultural critic. His research interests have taken him from exploring various dimensions of landscape archaeology within colonial Caribbean sugar plantations to Long Kesh prison in Northern Ireland. He's examined the material culture of European global expansionism, the transitory material presences across the displaced migrant camp, advancing a revising history of archaeological practices and their personalities, and questioning what the role of museums are and can be beyond monuments to the stolen things of empire. And he's even sought to interrogate and destabilize colonial memorialization, norms, and status quo justifications. And in the process, his writings have managed to engage and excite audiences that reach far beyond archaeology. And he's even managed to provoke or annoy a range of personalities, everyone from Tim Ingold to alt-right apologists to several members of Boris Johnson's government. So clearly he's doing something right. A common strand across his scholarship and writing has been to develop new connections, dimensions, and thinking about that archaeological gaze, as he says, by exploring the temporal boundaries between anthropological and archaeological inquiry, and expanding our research beyond the undocumented past we conventionally explore to account for the many undocumented presence of human lives and experiences that go unreported or unspoken, but are far from unimportant, and which archaeology can offer not just a source of evidence, but a means of making visible and creating space for dialogue. Many of Dan's interests have come together in his recent focus on the restitution of African cultural heritage from Euro-American collections and critique of museum collecting as a curated spoils of empire, or museums of nicked goods, if you will. His book, The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, is one of those essential contributions to the field that combines transformative and extensive research with excellent timing in order to engage and advance discussions of what a contemporary decolonizing of society needs to grapple with and redress. The volume is truly remarkable and an important interrogation of how things end up as the asserted national treasure of an imperial West, how museums come to commemorate these terrible imperial legacies of ultraviolence, what Dan has referred to as World War Zero, and how this institutional status quo continues to harm and injure descendants and societies around the world today. This work has received a truly astonishing level of enthusiasm and critical praise across media and news outlets as diverse as the New York Times, the Sunday Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Economist, Nature, CNN, and even Rolling Stone. It has also received dismissals as being little more than impassioned polemic and a number of reactionary critiques from the usual suspects, including a review in the Times that starts with an opening red flag statement. Is there some sort of career death wish going on around the staff at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford? Nothing too reactionary or chilling to see there, I'm sure. Through it all, Dan continues to promote the cause of restitution of African cultural heritage and invites us all to see, understand, and intervene with these imperial pasts and legacies as they play out in our presence. So it's with great pleasure that I turn over the Zoom floor and mic to Dan.
Wonderful. Okay, Neil, that was amazingly overwhelming. It is wonderful to be here. It's an honor to be here to give this named lecture. So I've got, I think we in total for this meeting, we have a little over an hour. I'm going to aim to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes and to talk in part about the book and in part about the conceptual sort of move that the book tries to do. So we're going to be talking about the necrographic. If you want the long version of this talk, there's a link in at the side there in the text to this piece with a series of responses that came out about a week and a half ago. But largely, I think we need to start with an account of what this book is and sort of how I, came to write it from Oxford and from sort of where I am speaking from now, from a space which is a Victorian space, from a space which was made in 1884 and where I've been curator for 14 years now. And I guess the point of the book, to some degree, is an observation that my role as a curator is, of course, to keep things, the same, to make sure that the sort of textiles are not eaten by moths, that the metalwork isn't rusting away. But curators have experienced a degree of mission creep. They have often sort of misunderstood their role as also trying to stop the world from actually continuing to change around them. And here in Oxford, as I'm going to tell you, we've seen a lot of such change since 2015. And how do we, as an institution, sort of navigate that change? I think, obviously, while I am talking about a space which is quite obviously a persistence from the 19th century, I'm sort of hoping that my words are going to be relevant for all those interested in anthropological knowledge, because the museum is a public space for anthropology in a four-field sense. And I think in that role, maybe it is the tip of an iceberg that is more generally about what some are calling how to decolonize our knowledge. So I think it's amazingly important that we recognize in a North American context, stolen land, as we, of course, importantly heard at the outset. But where does stolen art fit into knowledge as well as into ethical practice in the present? So that's really what the book is about. So here at the Pitt Rivers, as I say, which was founded in 1884, the same year as the Berlin Congress, so the start of what we often call, in a euphemistic way, the scramble for Africa, which we often envisage as a sort of elbowing out of the way of the different sort of powers from the European side, and often erase how much anti-African violence there was in that process. And 1884, of course, also was, here in Oxford, the year of the foundation of the Ashmolean Museum. So it was a moment of the disciplinary divisions that we make in between archaeology and anthropology, and even inside archaeology as a discipline. So the Pitt Rivers had been formed from the 1850s by a soldier, Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who largely acquired objects from London, from sort of dealers and from auction houses, although he excavated himself and arguably founded our discipline in terms of excavation in the modern sense, through excavations largely in the UK and Ireland, although also sort of elsewhere in the world, in France and elsewhere in Europe. He had founded that, but the founding of the museum also received other objects that were already in Oxford, that were from the Cook collections, that were from the early Ashmolean collections from the 17th century Virginia. And so there was a disciplinary reworking going on in 1884, where we have in the Ashmolean a vision of, if you like, the East and the West as sort of evidence of a civilized world, and then all the rest. It is the West and the rest, sort of, literally, that is being built at that point, even to the extent that when Heinrich Schliemann handed over objects that he had excavated in the 1890s from Troy, it was the case that Troy 1 to 4 is here at the Pitt Rivers, and the later phases of the Bronze Age actually went over to the Ashmolean. So there's a disciplinary work that's going on. There is the Berlin sort of meeting going on at that same moment. And a third thing that turns out to be quite important in the narrative that I want to tell you, which is the Maxim, which was a machine gun, was also invented in 1884 and was adopted in the Navy and the Army here in the UK in the early 1890s. And it turns out that that's an incredibly important part of this story, but it also links to the theories of Augustus Henry Lane Fox, as he then was when he was writing in the 1870s, before he inherited all the money and the name. Here's a drawing that he made in order to present his idea of how we ought to understand objects. And it's a diagram which is the evolution of the wooden stick, if you like. In the middle, there's a hypothetical stick. And then moving out to the edges, there are real objects, which are here in the Pitt Rivers on the upper gallery, which are the displays of weapons. These are objects which he acquired from a single sort of setting, or if you like, a cultural setting from Aboriginal Australia. And he's arranged them in what he called hypothetical series. So you can see moving out to the left-hand side, the boomerangs, you've got the shields to the right, you've got the clubs at the top right. And so based on, to a large extent, his experiences in the Crimean War, where the difference in between having a rifle or a, if you like, a musket, was so decisive in that war, he advanced a theory of the gradual improvement of objects over time as being incredibly important for weaponry. He was working in the museums of the Royal Armories and of the USI, the United Services Institute, which is now the sort of right-wing think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI. So RUSI had a museum and the armories had a museum. And these museums were filled with the weapons that had been obtained from the people whom the British had attacked around the world in the previous, I guess, 300 years or so. So what is Pitt Rivers sort of doing? In some ways, this is just a fairly conventional Victorian sort of improvement narrative. But it's also something else. He calls it the evolution of culture. And when he hands over the collection to Oxford, here as an institution, we are built as a physical extension of the Natural History Museum. And so the 1860 Natural History Museum is extended in 1884 into culture. And that enactment of his intellectual work, seeking to move evolutionary thought from the world of nature into the world of culture, is also a statement of a cultural superiority. It's also a statement that at the end of that evolutionary sequence, we are here in Oxford, in Victorian Oxford. So a moment came then in 2015 where the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford movement sent a tweet that completely changed my understanding of an institution, which at that point I'd worked in for a little over 8 years. And the tweet said that the Pitt Rivers Museum is one of the most violent spaces in Oxford. And, I have to say, in 2015, we were feeling pretty okay about ourselves as a discipline and as an institution here in Oxford. We had restituted ancestral remains to Maori communities and Aboriginal Australian communities. We'd hosted visits from the Haida. We'd held a potlatch on our anthropology lawn. We had worked with a whole host of source communities. And we had returned even actually cultural objects, in some cases, to First Nations. Suddenly a movement that came from South Africa was saying something really different about the museum. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement was and is a movement that came about in South Africa in early 2015 among a generation who'd been born after the end of apartheid. So they were born after 1994, and they were at the Cape Town at UCT in 2015. And there they were in an institution where racism and institutional racism was there as a part of their everyday lived experience. At the heart of the academy was also if you like, a figure of Rhodes at the heart of campus that actually, you know, not only symbolized, but was doing the work of institutional racism. So the image of Cecil Rhodes, I guess the founder in some ways of empire in a South African context as we understand it, as part of the later 19th century phase of empire, you know, the diamond miner, the mass murderer, all the things that we associate with Rhodes. And that figure and the removal of the, you know, of it was of such importance as a way of continuing to remove the normalization and the propaganda of a worldview that was continuing to exist. So these things, so the argument was a bit like with the Confederate statues in America, that art and culture was put to work to make a white supremacist worldview last. So in October 2015, through the Rhodes, if you like, the funds that fund the Zimbabwean and the South African, as well as the North American researchers, scholars every year who come to Oxford, there were people who'd been involved in these movements and this campaign who arrived in Oxford to find not only an image of Cecil Rhodes outside Oriel College, but also other examples of things that were built to make a Victorian sort of racist vision of the world, an imperial vision of the world, to make that vision last. So that included libraries named after Caribbean slavers, but it also included the Pitt Rivers. And what Rhodes Must Fall were really talking about was not the weapons on the top floor, but the displays that related to the violent examples of the dispossession of Africa, central among which is, you know, this incident. So in I guess the second third of what I want to tell you about, you know, let's get some of the detail of the Benin expedition and of some of the objects that were taken. And let's try and trace the link in between the military violence in Africa and the role and the complicity of the museum as an institution. So the Benin expedition was framed as a punishment, as a you know, a sort of device that we see again and again in empire, where a supposed, you know, earlier slight is used to justify an incredible use of force. So this is a pretext. This is this is a technique that we see later in Ireland and in sort of Kenya, the pretext of the reprisal. The attack is a coordinated attack which brings together not a colony but a protectorate. So this is the outer edges of empire where the, if you like, the usual legal sort of setups that we would see under a crown example of a colony are not sort of happening. So it's a protectorate, it's informal empire, and also the work of the company, the Royal Niger Company. So a lot of you will know about the company model for empire in terms of the British in relation to the Royal Africa Company in the 17th century, or the infamous East India Company, which of course had been long, you know, ended by the time we're in the 1890s. But the company model returns for Africa in the later 19th century. So the South Africa Company is a famous example that we just mentioned, which was run by Rhodes. But the Royal Niger Company, which is rather lesser known, was absolutely central. In this, absolutely centrally, it is a corporate colonial enterprise. And as I argue in the book, the corporate militarist phase that we see here has been, at the time, was described and is described today as if it's a series of individual incidents. But in many ways, what we're learning is that this phase of empire, this sort of second empire, late empire, from 1880s into the early 20th century, was it was in many ways an ongoing war. I call it World War Zero in the book. And as part of that war, as part of the removal of sovereignty and the attack upon traditional religion, looting became a central sort of tactic, a military tactic. And in the case of the Benin sort of city, so the Oba, the king of Benin, had been interacting with the British, had signed sort of various treaties over the years, and had been incredibly useful to the company and to empire over the years. But by the 1890s, in this real push, in the diamond year of the Victoria's of the reign of Victoria, so this is almost a Jubilee attack as well. There was a desire to move into rubber plantations, into oil palm. So in many ways, this is about sort of margarine. This is about the tires on the bicycles of Oxford. There was a desire to remove the Oba because he was in the way. He was being unhelpful. And, he was, of course, I mean, this is a royal line that reaches back, absolutely unbroken, even earlier than Elizabeth I. This is part of a set of West African civilizations, urban civilizations, with incredible traditions of art, of belief, of culture, and of urban living. And in the case of the landscape of Benin, you have to imagine a sort of set of abandoned palaces, where each Oba's palace, after he died, and the palaces of the Queen Mothers and so forth, had been allowed to sort of decay over time, but were sites for ritual and for respect and for engagement with the ancestors, for the ongoing existence of the ancestors in the presence of the royal ancestors. So it's a royal and sacred sort of landscape that the British then essentially attack and desecrate. Within weeks of this attack, which is made with the Maxim machine guns, which we've mentioned, but with sort of rocket launchers, with field guns, with sort of barbed wire, with electric lighting, with the technologies being experimented with on African bodies that would find their ways onto the soil of Europe in the early 20th century with such horror. So they are being employed to remove this landscape and to attack the city and to remove the Oba. And as part of it, the looting of objects, over 10,000 objects. Now, in terms of what we're talking about, most famously, I guess, we're looking at objects like this, the plaques, and the brass and the bronze plaques, which were on the pillars of the palaces, were there to show sort of court life. These are in many ways historical documents that go back over 500 years, that tell the history of the Obas, their interactions with the Europeans, and of court life, and the achievements of each Oba, and so on. Here they are on display, or some of them, at the British Museum. Often it's thought that these objects, in fact, are all in the British Museum. Only about 8% of what was taken, only about 900 objects, of which only 100 are actually on display, are in fact in the BM. And here on the right-hand side, you can see the case here in the Pitt Rivers, which are only yards away from me in that direction as I speak to you now. And so there you can see a range of other objects, all of which were taken in 1897. And those include the Oba's heads, as we see in the middle here. They include the ivory tusks, which were carved with these incredible iconographies that again are histories of each ober's achievements, and that were put in a hole in the top of the head of the ober in order to be a part of his history. But also a range of other forms. We've got the sculptural forms of the leopard or the hornblower as examples. We've got the famous masks, the ivory hip ornament masks, as we see an example of in the bottom left-hand side, but a host of other objects made of wood, made of coral work, and so forth. Here's a rare photograph from an individual that sort of visited the Ober in 1891. Hardly anyone accessed this site because it was a sacred site. So this art was entirely unknown, of course, outside of the royal court, until this attack. But you can see an altar here with the bells along the front and the Ober's heads with the ivory tusks, enormous ivory tusks in their heads, and a range of other figures in the back. So the story we've told is also a matter of the photographic. Here are two images from the collections of the Pitt Rivers that remind us, on the one hand, of the nature of the looting on the right-hand side, but also of the nature of the sheer destruction. So the Hague Convention of 1899, the first Hague Convention, was largely, the book argues, a response to the atrocity that happened in Nigeria at this point, or what was not yet Nigeria, but was being formed into Nigeria with the removal of this kingdom. So the Hague Convention listed the attacks upon sort of villages and unarmed civilians, the taking of art, the destruction of religious sites, and even dum-dum sort of uses of the bullet, the filing down of the bullet, so they caused more harm to the body. All of those things were used here in this attack. So recognizing that and understanding, I guess, I'd always believed what I'd been told about the Benin expedition until I began researching this book, that there was some sort of grim logic to the looting because the costs of the expedition had to be defrayed through the sale. So early on in the research, I searched for ages, thinking I'm going mad. I can't find any information, any documentation, of that formal sale. And it turns out it simply, didn't ever happen. So of the 1,200 or so of the plaques, about 300 were brought to the British Museum, of which 200 were retained and the other 100 were variously given away to civil servants and to the Queen, and some were sold. Then the rest of the other 900 of the plaques and the further more than 9,000 objects was simply taken by 200 soldiers, sailors, and administrators for their own sort of gain, for their individual personal gain. And within weeks, these were on display in museums in Oxford, in Berlin, in London. And at that point, it starts coming a little bit closer to home for the museum curator, who has to start thinking about the role of the museums in this process. So restitution, is an African-led movement, and it's one that has a history. Here is Ober Okenza II after the reinstatement of the Obers under the British, receiving the first restituted objects, which were the coral work sort of crowns and a coral robe. This is in an exchange, or in a not an exchange. I'm sorry, in a return, a permanent unconditional return that was overseen by the BM, actually by the British Museum, of objects that had been on loan to them. And of course, objects have been returning ever since. But of course, a lot remain sort of with us in the West. So the book starts to do some conceptual work as well. And I think the necrographic is one example. I made up a lot of words when writing this book. And I made up words really largely because I found so many of the theoretical framing that are current or available to us as archaeologists and anthropologists, as art historians, as any of those fields, are simply inadequate for talking about these histories. So there is no more familiar idiom for those that look at objects and, if you like, the material cultural world than the idea of the social life of things, of the object of an object having a biography. It's framing like that that can lead Hartwig Fischer, the British Museum director, to make the seemingly improbable idea, to put forward the idea that the taking of the Parthenon marbles was a creative act. When it comes to the taking of the Benin Bronzes, that argument has also been put. We imagine object life histories as being wholly additive. These objects are constantly being, we say, recontextualized. And the contextual archaeologies of the 1980s encourage us to think of each move, each new phase of life for an object as a sort of addition, as something added to that object, another layer on its life. But a bit like, as archaeologists, we all know that in the stratigraphic sequence through which any site forms, there are layers and there are fills, but there are also cuts. And there are relationships that we understand as archaeologists, which are interfaces caused by taking away, as well as, if you like, adding on. So in the life history of an object, we need to allow ourselves to talk about the digging of a ditch or the digging of a post hole, as much as the filling up of a ditch. It's silting up as the time goes on. So I employed the writer Achille Mbembe's critique of Foucault, which is a rather unlikely thing, but it's helpful, I think, in terms of the language here, in order to try to make sense of the idea of the life history of the object and find an alternative. So Mbembe takes the Foucauldian notion of the biopolitical and says that as an African, in the context of forced displacement, of sort of fortress Europe, of the deaths of Africans, in the Mediterranean every year, seeking to move from one location to another, we need not simply the Foucauldian notion of life as it's enacted in sort of medicine or the hospital, institutions like that, but we need a politics of who lives and who dies. Well, maybe for objects moving from Africa, we also need something that isn't wholly positive. So the notion of the necrographic and what the book calls the necrological, the knowledge of loss, the knowledge of death inherent in these objects, is a crucial, inverse, obverse of our knowledge of history and time and sort of the wider material world. So I'm hoping by now this rather, unusual word which I've employed is starting to make sense. We might add to it the weaponization of archaeology itself, because I'm not sure I've yet really convinced you that museums are complicit in this rather horrible attack that happened as part of colonial war. Fair enough, we might want to reframe 30 years of attacks after the Berlin Congress up to 1914 and First World War as World War Zero, okay, but are we convinced that we're really implicated as a discipline? So when those objects were displayed so quickly in our museums, here in Europe, anthropology was going through its sort of white supremacist phase. I mean, the physical anthropology museums were displaying skulls to tell the racist lie that there were different sorts of human. And as the book argues, the sort of crisis for whiteness in the long process after, after abolition and emancipation, led to a use of culture to tell a similar racist narrative of supremacy. It's interesting that after here in Europe, we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first actions that happened here in the Natural History Museum was the removal of the displays of human skulls that told that racist lie. But the cultural displays, such as the Benin case, that told the same story, but using culture, actually remained. We didn't realize what they were. But in the British Museum, when the Benin objects were first displayed, they were displayed alongside ancient Egypt in something called the Assyrian Saloon. And in that space, ancient Egyptian sovereignty was displayed alongside the Nigerian sovereignty that had just seen such violence and loss. That's what I call the chronopolitical. That we're all aware from the work of people like Fabian and others, that anthropology has often sought to collapse space into time to tell a narrative of a Euro-American exceptionalism. The idea that the further you travel from the metropolis, the further back in time you go, until you get to Tasmania or to Tierra del Fuego or wherever it is, and you're in the Stone Age. That entered a new phase in the 1890s, whereby you could destroy a culture and say, we've actually managed to blow you back, into the Bronze Age. That was the argument. So you can get into some of this other theory in the book if you're into that kind of thing. But let me just, in the final section, in the final, sort of 8 minutes or so of this talk, let me just say a little bit about how I think we can reframe this in more positive ways for the present moment, and how we can think hard about how museums are in a desperate need to keep in step with our changing times. So restitution and fallism. So the fallism movement to remove the images of white supremacy in the streets, the restitution movement to remove those same images from inside our museums, are African-led movements. And as we saw, they re-emerged in 2015 in Cape Town, but also 2015, of course, in a North American context, saw the beginning of a new phase in the ongoing struggle against racism, for civil rights. And from Ferguson to Charlottesville, a new moment happened. And as my colleague Nick Mizof has argued, we should see that moment as a fundamentally visual moment. The change happens because of visual technologies. So suddenly the dashcam footage and cell phone footage that is possible can make visible anti-Black violence that's been happening for centuries. And the fact it can be seen and shared, and he uses Hannah Arendt's idea of the space of appearance, but we could use we don't need that. We can simply make the point that the politics of seeing, the politics of saying names actually makes a new moment sort of possible. Here in Europe, what does that look like for our museums? Here in Europe, the moment of anti-racism that we find ourselves in is a reckoning with the observation that sort of racism has a history. So in many ways, we might see the civil rights movement and how it's affected anthropology and sort of public history in America, and I'm sure elsewhere in North America as well, was to observe that that racism had a history, and that related to enslaved people. So in historic houses, it became important, of course, to foreground African American history. Whole swathes of historical archaeology were put to work to try to write lives and see lives that were not in the written record, but were in the material record. Here in Europe, we are starting to realize that racism has a history. We've got a long way to go with anti-racism, but our history of racism is a history of empire. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for this movement? Saying names, shining a light, for me, the work of what some are calling the decolonization of museums, what I prefer to frame as the unfinished work of anti-colonialism, of anti-racism in our museums, starts, surprise, surprise, with the very normal and boring work of the curator. We just need to be doing our job actually better than we have been. Because it turns out that the Benin objects taken in 1897 are in more than 160 museums around the world. And by listing in a similar way to what we learn from the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are 4 Canadian museums in front of you there as well, if you can maybe just about read that. So from Quebec to Montreal to Toronto to Vancouver, there are memorials to white supremacy. There are ongoing, and the book argues we should see objects. I mean, for a long time, I've been arguing we should see objects as events. Here are 10,000 unfinished events. The sheer violence of this attack upon the Benin sort of city and kingdom shattered these objects around the world. But we don't know how this ends, in the same way as we don't know how the wider project for anthropology museums ends either. There's a lot to be hopeful about in this moment, I think. We've never needed something like a World Culture Museum more than we do today. We've never needed the public spaces of anthropology where we can combine archaeology and anthropology. We can tell stories of culture, of creativity, of art, of knowledge, of belief, of ways of being, ways of seeing outside of a Eurocentric lens. But that doesn't mean that these small, cancerous sort of vestiges of a period of time, a very narrow period of time between the 1880s and the 1920s, when art and culture were co-opted by white supremacy to naturalize, to justify, and to make endure that worldview. So Nigeria has been asking for these objects back for more than 100 years. And the book advocates for a case-by-case approach. This isn't about sending everything back, emptying our museums. So often, what the book calls the white projection of the logic of the punitive expedition, where you pretend someone is attacking you when you're the real aggressor. That's happened in Restitution. That's happened with people saying that this is simply, iconoclastic, that anyone that wants Restitution hates museums. I love museums. I love anthropology museums. I want to make them fit for the 21st century. I want to see world culture museums where nothing is stolen. I want to convince my North American colleagues that it doesn't matter how often an object passed legally in between white people in the North, it's still a stolen object. And the argument from the Metropolitan Museum that they bought it for, absolutely fair and square at auction simply won't wash. So time's up for this question. For us in the museum sector, restitution has been business as usual for Holocaust spoliation, for since the 90s, for ancestral remains to First Nations and to Maori communities and to Aboriginal Australia for a similar amount of time. How have we allowed ourselves to keep Africa and the dispossession of Africa out of this restitution sort of conversation and action, especially when that distinction that we make as curators in between human remains and sort of cultural objects, for many people, that is an irrelevance, because these sacred and royal objects do not simply sort of represent ancestors, they constitute ancestors in the present. So you can read, and I put in the chat a link to a bit more information about the book and to the most recent piece with these sort of 10 actually really diverse responses. I mean, one colleague at UCL absolutely hates the idea and wants to hang on to object biographies. There's a whole range of other readings from African, from American, and other colleagues, and so that's all online. And I guess that's me done. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was great, very thought-provoking. So Lindsay, you ready to moderate?
Yes.
There she is. Great. Okay, so Lindsay, it's all yours.
All right. Let me just watching here in the chat. Okay, so as a reminder, this is being recorded, but it only records who's speaking. So if you don't speak, then you don't get recorded. But if you have a question, you can use the little hand raising emoji, or you can let me know that you would like to ask a question in the chat, or you can ask the question directly in the chat and I can read it if that's your preference. Just making sure I don't miss anything here. Oh, okay, Lauren, yes, you can be our first guest.
Hi, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed that talk. My question is about the growing subfield or practice in archaeology of digital archaeology, where we're digitizing material culture, possibly at incredibly high resolution. And I was wondering if you believe this is a viable practice to aid in the efforts of repatriating original artifacts to home communities by replacing these reproduced images or printed replicas on display.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I would tell the story of the Yorkshire Ripper, who was a mass murderer, a serial killer who died recently. And quite rightly, there was an outrage that The Guardian produced an obituary of this man who was only famous because he killed women. And that, I think, tells us a lot about the potential for telling stories to reinscribe violence for descendants and for survivors. But imagine that this serial killer had kept objects from his victims. And imagine that when those who inherited those objects were asked to return them, they said, we'll return them, but we just want to 3D print every single one for our own purposes. Because of what? Because we're nostalgic for his violence, that we want to reproduce and hang on to that worldview. I mean, that seems, I mean, if that's the wish of the claimant, fine. But these are sacred and royal objects in a lot of cases, and they were taken for that reason. And this is about sovereignty. I mean, we're having a lot of conversations in the UK, as you may have heard, about sovereignty right now, which I think is a very interesting part of this wider mix. But so often the digital route is used by people who wish to hold up the conversation, who just have a problem with sort of giving back what they stole. You know, it's as simple as that. So I think all this talk about digital, fine, but it's a different conversation.
Great. That's a good analogy. I'm going to steal that, I think. Who else has a question? Great, Andrew, yeah. And then we'll have Lisa.
So you've got multiple audiences, obviously, to what you're presenting in your book and in your talk. Who do you see as your primary audience? Who are you really trying to get the message to?
Sure. So I think a big part of what I think we need to do as curators, what people like me, a white curator who is the curator of something called world archaeology. You know, these are 150 objects in the Pitt Rivers we have, I should have said, that were taken in 1897. That's 150 out of 600,000 objects in the museum. The reason to write this book was, maybe the way to answer your question. So I was at a meeting of the Benin Dialogue Group in Nigeria in 2019, at which all the richest and most influential, powerful voices from the European museums with large collections from this incident were there, alongside the many sort of Nigerian stakeholders, which includes, of course, the royal court. It includes the federal government and also the national government. And I was shocked by the sheer lack of, no, not even the lack of, the sheer obfuscation, the sheer, talk about entanglements and complexities from the European side. And it seemed to me that someone needed to tell this story that joined the dots in between extractivist colonialism and the museum in a clear way. So while it's responding to and seeking to amplify the voices, the ongoing voices of Nigerians for returns, it's aimed at those who believe that there's nobody in a museum that wants to see restitution. The intervention that I've done, the aim is to try to break apart, which it's, in some ways we're managing to do with this book, that idea that restitution is what Africans want and that sort of retention is what the museums want. There's a change in the generations happening in museums, which is fundamental. And we're seeing it in North America as well. There are so many museums that cannot square the treatment of African Americans and Africans in a different way from First Nations and essentially Native Americans on this question of restitution. So I think I'm writing for my professional colleagues, writing for my students, I'm writing for our disciplines. But it's also, the wonderful thing is a week ago, I was in a conversation with MC Hammer about this. So this is a serious sort of crossover conversation at the same time.
Okay, let's go to Lisa next.
Hi, I guess I wanted to ask, do you think necrographic framework is only really for artifacts contained in museums that were appropriated through violence, or is this something that fits within the frame of object itineraries more so than, and completely removed for the biographies of objects essentially? Because I know that, like you were saying, it's kind of an outdated model. Sure,
that's right. So I think, I think it's a fundamental shift in what it is to be a curator of objects that were taken, under duress, not only with violence, but under duress. And actually, importantly, the Sarr-Savoy report, the Macron report, introduced the language, actually much to the shock and horror of my French colleagues, the language of consent into the question of curation. And I think that's an incredibly important thing that the Macron report does. It starts saying it isn't only about the Benin Bronzes and the military taking. Where does archaeological collecting from Egypt fit into this? Where does natural history collecting fit in? There's a really interesting argument going on about a dinosaur in the Berlin Natural History Museum, which it turns out is an index sort of not only of however many millions of years ago that this thing existed, but is an index of 19th century exploitative mining enterprises in East Africa. So these histories, for me as a curator, we mistake ourselves. We're making a mistake if we think that my job is to research how these objects are able to tell us about the royal court in the 16th century or the 19th century, to understand what they meant for Edo people. That's crucial work, but it needs, first off, it's being absolutely suffocated by this secondary historicity, this big layer of loss and violence that we need to excavate. It's our problem. It's a big white layer that is just keeping that it's the only thing that these objects mean while they are demanded for return and while we fail to return them. So I call this a Euro-pessimistic approach. And so Euro-pessimism is my intellectual position here as a curator. That, and I guess as a historical archaeologist, really, that it isn't just that we have to write these sort of death histories, which of course is a history of the taking, you know, by sort of soldiers and by missionaries and whoever. That's all that my job is in these cases. And then the further crucial work can happen in Nigeria, led by Nigerians. Of course, if they want to loan objects internationally, that's great. That's up to them. But we remove the Europeans and the Americans from agency here because essentially we've got no right to sort of do that work. So even the other day, someone was saying about, oh, we'd like to do some XRF work on your sort of bronzes. You know, I don't think we can do that. I don't think that's right. I think that's not our focus right now. That work should be happening in Nigeria. The funding should go to Nigeria, and so on. So I think that sort of necrographic work, if it is about the secondary historicity of objects in museums, the history of our disciplines, the history of how our disciplines were actually part of all these other things that were going on, that includes a primary relationship to violence, a primary, if you like, a relationship to extractive colonialism. And here for a Canadian audience, actually, I mean, just to underline, it's weird how the Pitt Rivers mapped its restitution work onto settler colonialism while never taking a step in those cases of extractive colonialism. And in the book, I mention a bit of this, and I'm trying to think this through. So the distinction over ideologies of race that is in the Patrick Wolfe book called Traces of History, I think he called it, his last book. Wolfe, he describes trying to teach race in Australia, where there's a confusion between the blackness of Aboriginal Australians for an American audience that he's teaching there, who are on like a lecture tour or something. And he points out this odd process through which there is a process where settler colonialism had a history that involved sort of racialization that related to place, the notion of Indianness, indeed the ideas of indigeneity emerge from those, hand in hand with those processes. And in extractive colonialist context, most obviously the transatlantic slave trade, but also ongoing sort of violence on a military sense in Africa and elsewhere, and the physical movement of people away from a place, then actually racialization is inscribed onto the skin. Something very odd has happened, whereby that distinction for Wolfe finds a sort of odd echo in the fact that restitution is happening in one of those contexts, especially in relation to place and the idea of returns, and not in the other. And I think we need to work out, if we're going to tackle institutional racism in our discipline and in our institutions, I don't have an answer for that, but we need to make sense of that problem.
Okay, we have a couple that come from the chat, so I want to move to those. So here we go. The first one is asking if you could talk a bit more about the savior narrative that museums trot out to explain why they have materials and why they should keep them.
Sure, that's a really, really important point. So we're told, well, I guess, I mean, first off, all of the, you know, absolutely ridiculous arguments we heard against the returns in the case of Holocaust spoliation that were put in the 90s. You'll never find the right person to give it back to. You're raking up histories that no one wants to think about. What if you give it back and somebody sells it? What if you give it back and it's in a private house and no one sees it, the public can't see it? All of that completely rejected at the time. Of course, these are their objects. You give them back. You give back what was sort of taken. So under the very different historical circumstances of African spoliation of cultural objects, we have to push back on those questions. But a new set of narratives also emerge, even worse than there. The idea that Africans can't look after their own objects. The idea that things will be stolen, things will be sold, things will be destroyed by war. Somebody tried, there's a whole load of anti-Islamic sort of narratives here about the idea that the museums in Nigeria are going to get burned down. You know, the book shows that the supposed saving of these objects by the West was chaotic, that many museums, including the Second Pitt Rivers Museum, that he built on his own estate, where 268 of the most important of the Benin objects, which he purchased because he was so rich, were kept and were sold off when that museum was dispersed in the 1970s. Some are in the Metropolitan Museum, some are lost forever into private hands. So that happened. There's even examples, there are 2 examples of the Benin Bronzes being destroyed in UK museums in warfare because of the Blitz. So in Hull and in Liverpool, the bombing of museums led to the destruction of the Benin Bronzes that were supposedly being sort of kept safe. So the more you sort of peel back the onion layers of the Neil MacGregor style Universal Museum ideology, all these Universal Museums that happen to be in the global north and happen to be there to justify the hyper concentration of culture in the global north. It's all, the house of cards is just not, it's unsustainable. I can't, as a museum worker and an academic, I just can't allow myself to justify these things, which are just so patently wrong. A final thing to say on that point, though, is, of course, I mean, it's hard to imagine any book that is dated so quickly as the Neil MacGregor History of the World in 100 Objects. It's only 10 years old. And yet, even at the time, that sort of savior narrative, if you want to call it that, that authority voice of the British white sort of male, middle-aged or older curator who has all the answers, knows all the history, the objects are just there to illustrate the stories he's already thought up. That was already dead at that point. What we do across our museums is we co-curate, we foreground the community voices. We care about people more than we care about things. So the task for those in my position now is to seek to amplify the voices asking for restitution at the appropriate point, sort of to pass the mic, and in passing the mic, also to hand back the goods.
Okay, we have another one that's coming from the chat. This is from one of our undergrads. It's asking, do you or how do you differentiate between objects that are taken and displayed in museums from, for instance, ancient Egypt versus those taken more recently through direct violence in Benin?
So as I've said, there is a conversation going on. This is a live conversation in the museum world, in anthropology and archaeology, about whether archaeological objects were sometimes also taken under duress. I mean, I love Anne-Laura Stoller's notion of duress in her book, where she talks about how the etymology has the French sense of hardness, of dur, but also endurance, as well as the duress that was a part of colonial relations. You know, we need to learn from that, and we need to say, in some cases, you know, if something's demanded, you know, Nefertiti, for example, how do we approach that? That's why it has to be a case-by-case sort of process. I mean, here at Oxford, across the museums and libraries, we've just published a procedure for the return of cultural objects. And it's one that we will follow on a demand-based and case-by-case sort of basis. So in this conversation, there's a lot of whataboutery. There's a lot of, you know, not only whataboutism, but where will it endism. There's the spectre of the empty museum, emptied out institution. And absolutely, there should be some gaps in which we can in part make these institutions sort of sites of conscience. Sites, I mean, literally, I am sat now only yards away from human remains, from the brown people and the black people who were killed as part of, certainly under colonialism, which are here in the museum. You know, we are in part war zones, we're battlefields. That's part of our role. And we can't hide away from that. We can probably learn from other kinds of museum that has seen heritage museums as a way of doing, truth and reconciliation. If you like, the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, you could look at Holocaust museums, you could look at sort of war memorials, you could look at Northern Ireland. There are loads of other, or we can invent our own for anthropology, even better. Let's think about how part of our role is a role for remembering these histories, and the gaps are going to help us do that.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe 2 quick more. Andrew, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I see Ian has his hand up, and then we've got one more in the chat. So why don't we do those 2? Where did Ian go now? He disappeared.
Ian, you're muted.
Sorry, I thought I hit the unmute. Thank you, Dan, for a multi-layered presentation. It's given us a lot to think about. I hope this doesn't seem too particularist question, but your use of terminology of exfoliation, I find is kind of an interesting one, because you're borrowing a botanical term, and I'm wondering if it's maybe not your effort, but it could be seen as a move to sort of sterilize or remove some of the violence that you've been talking about.
Absolutely, and so I'm sorry, that is my English accent evidently not sort of coming across. So the word is spoliation, meaning sort of, if you like, to despoil. So okay. So it's another word for looting.
I'm sorry.
So no, that's just my English accent, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's an interesting idea, though. I think the natural history, there's a lot going on in between the natural history and the cultural history sort of worlds here in the history of our disciplines, and we should think about these.
And when you think about exfoliation, I mean, you're talking about, a stripping of a canopy, right? So yeah. there is an analogy there.
There certainly is, and the book absolutely uses, so I use Rob Nixon's wonderful term, slow violence, which he applies to environmental catastrophe caused sort of by colonialism. And that idea that, the rising sea levels is incremental year on year, the destruction of rainforests and its effects, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's gradual. It's a violence that happens at that kind of pace. What if the museum is itself a technology for slowing down violence so it persists? So when the Roads Must Fall movement arrived in Oxford, it could experience that violence from 1897, more than a century later. And that absolutely is a theme that's in the book. Yeah.
Sorry, we have another one in the chat, which is about your concept of necography. And if you could speak a little bit more about it, and if you could say why you find object biographies approaches theoretically limiting.
Sure, absolutely. And so I did say that in the talk, but I'm happy to repeat it. The notion of an object life history makes us imagine that the object is stable, and it's moving between a set of unstable cultural contexts, adding an extra layer sort of onto its life in a positive way, as if archaeological sites formed, that old question that we've all been asked by archaeology, by non-archaeologists. If the world is if there are constantly layers and layers and layers, is the world getting bigger? is that what archaeology understands? There are more and more layers. But of course, no, there are hand in hand with the addition of layers onto archaeological sites, there are processes of those things being removed. Maybe the same happens for objects. Maybe we need a language that can allow us to talk about the cut, about the, if we go to Ed Harris's, terminology, he talks about the vertical interface and the horizontal interface. And of course, the thing about the vertical interface, when we draw an archaeological section, is that it doesn't have any substance. It's a relationship. It is not something that you give a number to it, you record it, but it's evidence of something being taken away. And I think that's what I'm trying to grasp, something we need some sort of terminology in our museums to acknowledge what's been taken so we can tell those histories, not undo them, but excavate them. Archaeology is the opposite of history in many ways for me. It's the inverse of history. We start sort of with the present, with the most recent layer, and we work from the known into the unknown, sort of famously. Even Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers understood that. So maybe we need something similar for objects. Why did we allow that historical turn of the 80s and 90s in anthropology? Why did we allow that to become the only way in which we talk about objects in our museums? That historical turn, and I've sort of often thought, was anthropology's coping mechanism for postmodernism. There was they sort of looked, as a discipline, we sort of looked over the precipice at, Deleuze or whoever it was, and thought, we're going to need some way of talking about sort of multiplicity, but we can't just deconstruct everything. So what can we do? And history filled that void. Salins, with, if you like, Eric Wolf, those sorts of people. And then it became embedded in the people I'm really critiquing in this book. So sort of Nick Thomas on entanglement. We've seen what Hodder has done with that more sort of recently, and the relational uses of actor network theory and all that stuff. This book is actively rejecting all of that. It's saying we need to find a new vocabulary to talk about things that the rest of the world really cares about. So it turns out that art is really important, and culture and objects are fantastically important in world history and in the present. And so those, in our discipline, and maybe some people listening now, who may even yet be unconvinced that restitution should be a priority for the so-called real work of anti-racism, the real work of sort of looking at empire. Well, white supremacy understood the power of art and culture. They understood that once you put up a statue or a museum display, it's incredibly hard to take it down. And that's where the necrographic really comes in, or the necrological, the knowledge of loss, the knowledge of death. Part of our discipline is that. And in the undoing, of that violence, insofar as we can, there has to be a new sort of a memory work, a new sort of a memorial. We have to undo the memorialization and think about other forms of memory, which isn't celebratory, but which has got some dignity in it. And let's absolutely also make sure we talk about all those other human remains where there's so little known about these things. There isn't going to be a place for these ancestors to go back to. And we saw that at Harvard a couple of weeks ago at the Peabody, where the 20,000 individuals represented in their physical anthropology collections, somebody observed that six, I have to say is a rather unlikely low number, but 6 of those people were enslaved African Americans. Who were the other, 19,994? And when are we going to talk about that? We've tried for too long to bury these objects in the stores. We've reduced museums to just being about the displays. Less than 1% of African objects that were taken under colonialism that are in our UK museums are on display. Most of them are in the stores, even for the Benin Bronzes, for the British Museum, only 100 of their 900 objects are on display. So this is about excavating the archives. This is about trying to justify the retention of things that one day we might look at, one day we might want to research. It's nonsense, and it's time, as I said, time's up.
Yeah, time's up for a lot of different things.
For a lot of things.
I'm mindful of our time here and how long people have been seated and in front of screens, because but so much of what you said is resonating with our grad theory class, and I know we'll probably have lots of connections to make in our next meeting. But Andrew, did you want to say a final thanks?
Yeah, I think we're coming up to the hour-and-a-half limit there. So thank you, Lindsay, very much for moderating the questions. And Dan, thanks again for a very thought-provoking talk and a great question and answer session. I think it's been a great experience for our students and for everybody who's joined us from wherever you all are. Welcome again. And so thanks very much.
Wonderful.